What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Thanksgiving used to be my favorite day of the year, not because of the food or the endless parade of casseroles, but because, for one day, it used to feel like we were all pretending to be a normal family. Somewhere along the way, that illusion cracked, and now the holiday just feels like a stage where everyone performs who they think they are. Mom plays the role of the warm-hearted hostess. Dad mumbles his way through grace while secretly hoping no one starts an argument, and Ryan, my older brother, sits there like the golden statue of everything I was supposed to become but never did. And me? I'm the supporting character who wandered into the wrong movie. This year, I told myself I wouldn't go. I even made a promise out loud, standing in my kitchen 2 nights before. This is the year I skip it. But the next morning Mom called, her voice full of practiced guilt and artificial sweetness, saying, "It just wouldn't be the same without you, honey." So I went, not out of love, but curiosity. I wanted to see if they could manage to pretend everything was fine one more time. The house smelled the same as always: turkey, butter, and some overcooked attempt at a family memory. The minute I stepped through the door, I could tell Mom had already cataloged everything about me: the coat that wasn't designer, the shoes she thought looked too practical, and the fact that I came alone again. Her eyes moved fast, like she was taking inventory of disappointment. Ryan arrived just after me, loud and cheerful, carrying a bottle of wine he'd probably grabbed last minute at a gas station, but Mom greeted him like he'd just brought gold from a faraway kingdom. "There's my success story," she said, hugging him so tightly it almost looked painful. His wife Katie followed, balancing a pie and that polished smile she always wore, the one that never quite reached her eyes. We sat around the table, the usual arrangement: Mom at the head, Dad to her right, Ryan across from me like it was some kind of family symmetry test. I'd barely put my napkin on my lap before Mom started. "So, Emily," she said, with that tone that always sounds polite to outsiders, but feels like a knife to me, "how's that little place of yours?" "Still renting." I smiled. "Still living." Ryan chuckled, already enjoying the show. You should think about buying. Rates are high, but it's an investment. Katie and I just closed on a place downtown. Great spot. 2 bedrooms, balcony, gym access. You should come see it, maybe it'll inspire you." I felt that familiar burn rise in my chest, not anger, just exhaustion. They'd never once asked me what I actually wanted from life. The only metric that mattered was ownership, marriage, children, checkboxes they could brag about at dinner parties. Mom leaned back in her chair, pretending to sound casual. "Your brother's really stepping up, isn't he? It's so nice to see him settled. Makes a mother proud." She looked directly at me when she said it. "Isn't it time you did too?" I felt the room tilt slightly, that moment before a storm when even the air seems to go silent. Dad cleared his throat, pretending to rearrange the silverware, and Katie smiled, the kind of smile people give when they're waiting for someone to explode. But I didn't. I just took a sip of my wine, set it down slowly, and said quietly, "I already have a house, Mom." The sentence dropped like a brick in the middle of the table. Even the soft hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen seemed to stop. Mom blinked, confused. "What?" I kept my voice calm, too calm, the kind of calm that hides fire. "I already have a house. I just didn't invite anyone who looks down on me." Her fork slipped from her hand and hit the plate, the sharp sound echoing through the room like a crack in the glass. Ryan froze, caught mid-smirk. Katie's eyes darted toward Mom, and Dad just stared at his plate like maybe if he stayed still long enough, he could disappear into the mashed potatoes. For a moment, no one said a word. The turkey steam rose like fog between us, and I could feel every pair of eyes trying to measure how serious I was. I didn't flinch. I just picked up my glass again, took another sip, and waited. Mom's voice finally broke the silence, softer now but laced with disbelief. "You have a house?" I met her gaze. "Yes." She laughed once, that nervous, high-pitched laugh she used whenever reality didn't fit her version of it. "Well, isn't that something? And here you've been so quiet about it. When did this happen?" I shrugged. "A while ago. It just didn't seem worth mentioning." Ryan leaned forward, trying to find a way to regain control of the room. You mean you bought a house? Or are you talking about some little condo you're renting and calling it a house? I looked at him the way you look at a mosquito buzzing too close. No, Ryan. I mean I own a house. He let out a low whistle, forced and patronizing. Well, congratulations, little sis. Didn't think you had it in you. Neither did Mom, I said, not smiling. The silence that followed was heavier this time, the kind that makes you aware of every breath. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her glass. I'm happy for you, she said finally, but the words were hollow. She wasn't happy. She was unsettled. The narrative had slipped out of her hands, and she didn't know how to grab it back. Dinner continued, or at least pretended to. Small talk returned in fragments, Katie asking about recipes, Dad mumbling something about football, but the air never recovered. Every clink of a glass sounded like judgment, every pause like a question no one wanted to ask. As I sat there, I realized this was the first Thanksgiving where I wasn't trying to earn anyone's approval. I didn't need to. I had walked through fire, built something of my own, and kept it hidden not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. They wanted me small, predictable, dependent. Instead, I'd become invisible in a way they couldn't understand, successful on my own terms. When dessert was served, Mom barely looked at me. Ryan was still pretending not to care, but his leg bounced under the table like a ticking clock. I knew what would come next, the questions, the suspicion, the sudden interest masked as concern. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel cornered. I excused myself before coffee, stood up, and said, "Thanks for dinner." No one stopped me. As I walked toward the door, I could hear Mom whispering to Ryan, "Did you know about this?" His quiet, nervous laugh followed me into the hallway. Outside, the cold air felt sharp and clean. I took a deep breath, and as the sound of that fork hitting the plate replayed in my head, I realized I'd never forget it, not because it hurt, but because it was the sound of everything finally breaking the way it was supposed to. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke before the sun, the house still cool and dim, and lay in the quiet with the kind of heavy, stretching silence that follows a storm, replaying the night in slow motion while the simple truth pressed against my ribs like a fist. Because what unsettled my mother was not the sentence I said, but the years I said nothing, the long patient seasons when I let them believe I was running in circles while I was laying brick on brick in a place they never bothered to visit. And if that sounds harsh, then maybe you have never watched your own reflection shrink in the eyes of people who are supposed to love you without conditions. I remember the earliest rehearsals of that smallness the way other people remember favorite songs. The senior year cookout when Mom asked in a voice sweet enough to rot teeth whether my scholarship meant I could finally stop trying to be artistic and pick a major that could pay rent one day. The winter after graduation when I brought home a portfolio I was proud of, and she turned it over like it might stain the table, asking whether the company cafeteria had good benefits since I would be eating there a lot. The summer I moved into my first studio with the alley view and the stubborn radiator, and Ryan carried in one box, then loudly announced he had to leave for a real meeting, kissing Mom on the cheek while she told him not to strain his back. And later, when my first long relationship fell apart quietly, how she folded a dish towel and said maybe if I were less independent and more agreeable I wouldn't scare men off, as if self-respect were a fire alarm set too close to the stove. The truth is that my revenge did not begin last night. It began the first time I learned to metabolize the sting into fuel, working hours that were not pretty or efficient or Instagram-worthy. Living by spreadsheets and grocery lists, and the kind of tired that grows behind the eyes. Taking every cheap job in interiors no one wanted, the basement powder room with the uneven floor. The rental lobby that had to look expensive on a budget that could barely cover paint. The funeral home waiting area where all they wanted was calm. And then, when the rhythm of surviving started to feel like music, I registered a tiny company with a plain name that never touched my family's dinner table because I learned to keep warm things away from cold hands. It took years to assemble the down payment the way you assemble a life you actually want, in small steady actions and 1,000 refusals to quit. And when the mortgage broker shook my hand, I drove straight to the little duplex with the overgrown hydrangeas and stood at the sidewalk staring at it like a person might look at a stranger they somehow recognize. And I promised myself I would not make a single move out of spite, that every decision would be boring and orderly and lawful, that if satisfaction came it would arrive by mail with signatures and timestamps, and not with shouting, because quiet victories do not need applause to be real. People like to think turning points come with trumpets, but mine came with calendar invites and inspection dates and the slow grind of drywall dust, and as tenants cycled through, couples who fought in whispers. A retiree who left little thank you notes in the rent envelope. A man who once asked me if I could bend the late fee because you know how it is. I learned that leadership can be a very gentle kind of power when you refuse to use it for show, that boundaries, when written clearly and enforced without anger, become a form of mercy for everyone involved. After I left my parents' house last night, I drove around the block twice to cool the heat in my chest, then went home, washed the smell of butter out of my hair, and opened the management dashboard I keep organized the way I keep my drawers, neat and labeled. And there it was, a small red dot next to Unit B that had been blinking since the afternoon, a request wrapped in charm and bravado asking if the first month grace period could stretch just a little, paired with a winking promise that future payments would be rock solid, the kind of message that expects the word yes because the sender has always heard it from someone, and I read it twice, then a third time, and pictured a set of keys twirling on an index finger at a dining table where bragging is a family dialect. I drafted a response that read like policy rather than pain, a clear paragraph about fairness to all residents, about the necessity of applying the same standards no matter how confident the tone of a request might sound, about late fees existing not to humiliate but to keep the roof repaired and the water hot and the foundation sound, and I scheduled it to send at 9 the next morning after the banks opened, which is to say I set my small, lawful revenge on a timer. Because the cleverness was not in the sting, but in the lesson that grown adults eventually learn when no one rescues them from agreements they signed with eager hands. Before I closed the laptop, I scrolled through older notes, the routine details that would bore anyone not invested in the slow architecture of a life, a reminder about the annual inspection of smoke detectors, a scheduled visit from the plumber to replace a shut-off valve that sticks, a photograph of sunlight on the stairwell. I had painted the color of early pears, and I felt the strangest mixture of tenderness and steel, because this was what they never understood when they dismissed my choices as temporary, that the work I do may be quiet, but it is not small, and the house I keep may be modest, but it is mine, and respect is not a favor you owe to the loudest person in the room. At 9, the message went out exactly as written, unadorned and undeniable, and I sat at my kitchen table with coffee and an old notebook open to a page where I had once scrawled in tired handwriting the sentence, "Stop asking permission." And I listened to the clock tick and allowed myself one long, unpretty laugh that did not echo in anyone's ears but mine, because sometimes the most satisfying revenge is not the grand reveal or the dramatic confrontation, but the simple act of refusing to bend where you used to fold, especially when the person on the other end believes the world will always tilt in their direction, and especially when you know, but will not yet say, how familiar their voice sounds when it asks for exceptions. By the time the sun found the kitchen tiles and warmed them into pale squares, the email had already left my outbox like a small arrow aimed at a target I pretended not to recognize. And while the kettle rattled and hissed, I let myself drift through the rooms of the house that nobody in my family believed existed, touching the backs of chairs I had reupholstered at midnight because fabric choices feel easier than people, and pausing at the hallway mirror where the ghost of a younger version of me used to ask whether I was being stubborn or merely careful, the distinction mattering because caution builds homes while pride builds traps, and I had sworn to choose the former even when the latter sang my name. I keep the proof of my life in tidy folders because chaos looks too much like the past, so there are receipts tucked in clear sleeves and inspection photos labeled by month and a calendar that hums like an engine with reminders to service the furnace, renew the insurance, Schedule the gutter cleaning before the maple throws down a wet orange carpet, and woven among those obligations are the quiet pieces of a business that nobody clapped for yet somehow keeps the lights on, client sketches. Annotated in pencil, invoices that paid in increments and sometimes late, mood boards clipped from magazines the way someone else might keep postcards, each of them evidence that interior design, when practiced without theatrics, is less about making rooms pretty and more about giving people breathing space where they can survive their own evenings. It is an odd feeling to own a house you do not brag about, to pass the hydrangeas without announcing you planted them yourself from abused sticks the previous owner hacked down, to smile at the way the morning catches the stairwell I painted that pear color because I needed the climb to feel like fruit ripening rather than duty, and to know that the best decision you made was buying the property under a company name so plain it slides past your family like water, not a disguise exactly but a boundary, because anonymity is a soft shield in a world that delights in pulling off masks to see who flinches first. I am not naive, though some would call it cruel, and I hear their imagined voices in the back of my mind when I open the tenant ledger and see the neat line that now includes a small penalty. Because there is a part of the audience who will insist that mercy requires exceptions, that kindness should be flexible, that blood should outrank policy, and to them I would say that kindness without structure becomes enablement, that our roof stands because beams do not apologize for bearing weight, that fairness to one is unfairness to the rest, and that, despite the ache in my throat, I will not forgive what has not been asked for, at least not with my bank account. The reply arrived just before noon in the voice I expected and yet still felt snag against my ribs, polished and breezy with a charm as practiced as my mother's Thanksgiving smile, full of little assurances and gentle pressure and a hint of insult dressed as humor. Surely a small family discount could be arranged. Surely the paperwork people could be persuaded to look the other way for just this first month. Surely the owner would understand because we are all trying to get our footing in this economy, and I read those lines like a detective reads a confession where the crime is entitlement and the weapon is plausible deniability. Then I opened the lease, highlighted the relevant clause, and sent back a message that was firm without heat, pointing to dates and definitions and the equal treatment of all residents, which is to say I extended the kind of respect that never once extended itself to me at that family table. Work, as it always does, rescued me from sentimentality because a client texted about a sofa delivery wedging through a too narrow hallway, and I spent an hour guiding movers by a speakerphone while balancing the tape measure between shoulder and ear. And afterward I ate standing up the way I sometimes do when the day refuses to be elegant, and I told myself that if justice exists at all it probably looks like this. These mundane executions of plan over impulse, these small promises kept within agreed hours, while beneath the surface the deeper promise I made to myself a long time ago remained intact, that I would not use my success to humiliate them even when the opportunity glimmered like a dangling earring in a store window I couldn't afford at 20. Late afternoon brought the soft drizzle that makes the neighborhood smell like pennies and leaves, and I walked the block with my umbrella tilted against the slope of the wind, pausing across from the duplex to make sure the new lock plates were seated cleanly and the exterior lights triggered on schedule, the kind of inspection that looks like nosiness to anyone who has never paid a roofing invoice. And just as I turned back toward home my phone buzzed with a call from an unsaved number whose area code I knew as intimately as the freckles on my forearm, and I let it ring twice before answering because theater, even the quiet kind, requires timing. "Hi there," the voice said, bright and casual in a way that tries to step over the line it knows is there. "I was told you're the point of contact for Unit B, and I wanted to make sure we're all squared away because there was a little confusion about the fee." "Nothing serious. Totally workable. I'm Ryan, by the way, Ryan Carter, and maybe we can sort this out person to person since we're practically neighbors now." There are sentences that arrive like weather fronts, slow and undeniable, and as he spoke I felt the air change and something in my chest settle with a clarity so sharp it almost felt like relief. Because standing there beneath the umbrella, with the rain prickling the fabric and the streetlights flickering on, I finally understood that the story I had been dragging behind me since childhood had looped around and placed itself in the palm of my hand without my pushing, the proof not written in ink but spoken into my ear by a man who had never imagined the invisible could hold a key to his front door, and while I kept my voice even and professional and asked him to confirm his email for our records, I looked at the duplex windows glowing in the early dark and thought, not for the first time, that sometimes revenge does not arrive as a blow but as a mirror, and that the face you see there can either learn or double down. And the cliff we were both approaching would be decided by which of those choices he made in the next breath. The rain kept its patient tempo on the umbrella as Ryan introduced himself like a stranger who assumed charm carried the same authority as a signature, and while he tried to step over the boundary with phrases polished by a lifetime of easy rescues, I let the pause between us lengthen until his voice searched for footing, then answered in the tone I reserve for contractors, bankers, and people who confuse proximity with leverage, explaining that I was indeed the point of contact listed in the lease packet, that the fee he referenced was not a surprise but a scheduled consequence described in clear language on page 5, and that the path forward was simple, not personal, and very boring. Which is usually where fairness lives when the show is over and the lights come up. He laughed lightly, the way a person laughs when the reality of adulthood nips their ankle, and suggested we reset, perhaps meet that afternoon at the unit so he could square away the small stuff. And as he pitched the meeting, I pictured the kitchen where I chose a countertop color with enough warmth to forgive a late winter, the living room where I had measured sight lines to make the space feel wider than the mortgage would allow, and the front door where guests would arrive for his inevitable housewarming because performance is religion in my family, and I said yes, not because I owed him a favor, but because clarity sometimes benefits from a door frame and a clipboard. Inside Unit B, the air still held the new paint smell that makes people believe in fresh starts, and Katie was there in a sweater the color of forgiveness, stacking plates on the counter with a careful cheerfulness that works in holiday photos. And she smiled too quickly when she saw me, a smile that wobbled when I introduced myself by name and title, and for a moment I could almost feel sorry for the two of them, small figures at the beginning of a maze they did not map, until Ryan started talking again in the tone of a man who has rehearsed his persuasive face in every reflective surface he's ever passed, insisting that the late fee could be rolled into next month because cash flow is just weird after closing, and gesturing vaguely toward the balcony as if the view itself might negotiate on his behalf. I laid the packet on the counter where the plates had been and slid a highlighted page toward him with the same choreography he'd used to slide superiority across 1,000 family dinners, and I explained, without vinegar, that the fee stood, that the building required proof of renter's insurance by Monday at 5 in the afternoon, that a copy of the utility confirmations must be uploaded to the portal before the weekend, and that a routine safety inspection would occur on Saturday at noon with or without their attendance, which was already set on the calendar and had been noticed in writing, because the boiler contractor was available only at that time and, in the interest of everyone's hot showers, we were going to make that window weather or not someone had promised a party. You should have seen the shift then, the way charm retreated and calculation stepped forward, the way Ryan's jaw set into that stubborn Carter angle I had seen in the bathroom mirror at 12 when I refused to cry in front of Mom. And he said they had planned a small gathering at noon, nothing major, just family and a few friends, and surely we could reschedule because you know how it is, and in the space between his request and my reply I remembered the clatter of my mother's fork, the applause she offered him for simply arriving in a room, the 19 separate times I swallowed humiliation so dinner could proceed, and I decided that my revenge would not be loud or cruel, but exquisitely administrative. The kind of justice that tastes like plain water and is therefore undeniable. The inspection is non-negotiable, I said, not unkindly, but it will be brief, and afterward your guests will enjoy a boiler that won't fail mid-shower, and then I added, almost as an afterthought, that our locksmith would also be on site to complete the rekeying required after new occupancy, a standard procedure scheduled for the same hour, and that new keys would be available immediately upon settlement of the outstanding balance in the portal, which is to say the party could begin on time. If the payment did, and for a heartbeat the three of us stood inside the gentle quiet that follows a truth told without ornament. Katie recovered first, reaching for sanity the way a person reaches for a railing in the dark, and asked what they needed to do, her voice soft but steady, and I outlined the checklist with professionalism so calm it felt like kindness, then left them with copies. A welcome letter and the small branded folder my printer produced in batches of 50 because my life, unlike their narrative, comes bound by staples and planning, not applause, and as I reached the door my phone buzzed with a message from Mom asking whether I was coming by Sunday for leftovers because we should talk like adults, which landed like a dare on the kitchen tile and set the stage before I had even decided to step onto it. Sunday arrived with that falsely innocent sunlight that makes people confident they can rewrite endings, and I took the long route to my parents' house past the duplex to confirm the contractor's van would have space to park, which it would, because I had asked the neighbors the day before to leave the curb clear in exchange for fresh coffee from the shop on the corner, an exchange that felt like community rather than manipulation, and when I finally pulled into my parents' driveway the smell of reheated gravy lifted like a memory I was no longer willing to eat, and Mom opened the door wearing a smile that had practiced all night, saying we could make this right because family is a circle, not a ledger, and behind her, at the table, Ryan's phone lit up with the portal notification announcing payment received and keys ready, followed immediately by the second notification confirming the safety inspection and rekey were underway, and he looked up at me with a glare that confused accountability with betrayal. I sat down, folded my napkin in my lap because ceremony still matters even when the script is different, and waited while Mom poured coffee and began the speech about loyalty she keeps in a drawer for moments like these, sprinkled with phrases like, "After all we've done," and "Why would you embarrass us?" And when she reached the part where she declared I had blindsided the family, I told her very evenly that the lease had been signed by adults who can read, that the schedule had been posted for days, that I was not punishing anyone but prioritizing the same order that keeps roofs from leaking and firefighters from writing citations, and that love, if it exists in this house, will survive the discovery that I am neither a doormat nor a secret. Across the table, Dad stared into his cup as if answers settled like grounds if you watched long enough. Katie checked her messages with a look that understood the difference between inconvenience and consequence. And Ryan pushed back his chair with the scrape of a man who believes volume restores control, asking whether I felt powerful ruining their first party before it began, and I almost laughed because I had not ruined anything. I had simply insisted that the world remain the world for once, even on a Sunday, even in a family where rules are costumes we wear in front of strangers, and while he waited for me to flinch, my phone vibrated again with a photo from the contractor showing the old lock guts in his gloved hand and the new deadbolt seated cleanly, a small gleaming circle of inevitability. I could have said many things then, about the years I spent learning to be boring and relentless so days like this could feel like air, about the mercy of boundaries, about how quiet revenge is just another name for finally living by your own standards. But instead I sipped my coffee and said only that the keys were waiting for him when he was ready, that the boiler passed with warmth to spare, and that the next time he planned a gathering he should check the building calendar like every other resident, because equality, inconvenient as it is, remains the only kind of respect I have left to give, and as the room absorbed that sentence my mother's fork, as if on cue, tapped her plate twice like a tiny gavel. And in the silence that followed Ryan's jaw worked, his eyes cutting to our parents with a calculation I recognized too well, right before he said the one sentence that could turn this quiet order into a wildfire. And the look he gave me promised he would light it if I did not blink. First, Ryan's chair stopped scraping and his voice, low and deliberate in that way people adopt when they believe menace is the shortest route to respect, cut through the kitchen with a sentence designed to scorch rather than convince, telling me that if I thought I could play landlord and big shot while embarrassing him in front of our parents, he would make sure everyone in the family knew exactly how small and calculated I really was, a person who hid behind a faceless company and a stack of policies because she had nothing else to show, and while he spoke I watched the delicate tremor in my mother's hand as she studied her fork against her plate like a telegraph key tapped by a person sending a message from a ship they had insisted wasn't sinking. I answered the way I have learned to answer when the theater swells and everyone leans forward expecting flames, with an even voice and a careful sentence that refused the invitation to cruelty, telling him that he could say whatever he needed to say to whomever he liked because facts survive gossip the way brick survives weather, and that the truth he found so insulting was simply that I had built a life that did not require his approval or my mother's choreography, a life registered under a plain name because peace prefers quiet labels, a life that would keep standing long after the applause around his newest story died down. And although I could see the fury sharp in his eyes, I also saw the more dangerous emotion behind it. The quick calculation that asks whether humiliation can be outsourced to a parent who has never once resisted the urge to tidy the narrative for a son who makes a mess and calls it momentum. Mom turned to Dad for backup that never arrives on time and, finding only the polite cough of a man who hates thunderstorms but leaves the window open anyway, pivoted toward me with a plea for family understanding, which in our house has never meant mutual respect so much as the soft erasure of whatever makes Ryan uncomfortable, and the moment stretched there between us like wet linen on a windless day until my phone, faithful to the rhythm of cause and effect, offered a small chime that announced the rekey completed, the boiler signed off, the inspection filed, and, as if the building itself had raised a hand, a second chime confirming the quiet arrival of a noise complaint from the unit below theirs. Time-stamped at noon with a description that could have been lifted from any Carter gathering, too many voices competing for a crown that does not exist. I did not gloat, and I did not scold. I stood, thanked my mother for the coffee she had not sweetened enough to hide its bite, and told Ryan that his keys were available for pickup at the office the moment he acknowledged the house rules in the portal, that a warning had already been issued to the unit for the noise because the system does not recognize last names, and that the second warning escalates to a fine which, like gravity, falls the same on every head, and when he opened his mouth to argue, I held up my hand the way a crossing guard stops a car, not to humiliate him, but to make sure none of us were run over by a story that had finally ended. Because there is a particular kind of mercy in refusing to repeat the argument that made you small for most of your life. I left before the next act could begin, drove through the thin winter sun, and parked in front of the duplex, where the new deadbolt caught the light like a coin under glass. Then walked the side path to check the gutter seam I had asked the roofer to reseal, and stood there for a long moment with my hand on the cool downspout, not thinking anything noble or cinematic, simply counting the places in my body where the old reflex to apologize was still trying to blink awake, and when the count reached 0, I unlocked my own door across town and stepped into the room I painted that pear color because it makes afternoons feel like an orchard instead of an obligation, set my phone on the counter, and allowed the house to hold me without asking what I had earned. 2 days passed with the ordinary music of responsibility, emails answered without flourish, a site visit where a client's toddler announced that my samples were soft like pancakes, a pharmacy pickup for Dad that I left on their porch because care does not always require conversation, and on the third evening, as the streetlights stitched their quiet pattern across the blinds, my phone lit with a message from my mother that read like a recipe for reconciliation, a little guilt, a little tenderness, a reheated memory or two, asking me to come by on Sunday so we could clear the air and start fresh, followed by a separate, shorter message from Ryan that contained no flourishes at all. Only the screenshot of his acknowledgement in the portal and the sentence, "We'll keep it down," which, for a Carter, is a confession dressed up as compliance. I typed nothing for a long while, letting the cursor blink like a metronome that refused to hurry me, and when I finally moved I sent one message to my mother and none to my brother, a simple line that said I hoped she and Dad were well, that I was busy with a deadline this week, that we could talk when I had the bandwidth, which is to say when I could enter that house without dissolving into the old shape they preferred, and I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark listening to the thermostat click and the refrigerator hum and the soft creak that happens when the hallway warms, ordinary sounds that, stitched together, form the anthem of a life built stone by stone without witnesses. In the quiet that followed, I thought about the unforgiving symmetry of the journey that had carried me from that table to this chair, how my revenge, if it deserves that name, had not been the moment I revealed anything but the years I refused to. The patient practice of becoming solid in a family that loved fog, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether forgiveness is a door you open for yourself rather than a gift you hand to the people who insist they never closed it, then stood and walked to the window where the street was empty and the porch light threw its clean circle on the steps, and I told myself that one day I might hand my mother an extra set of keys with no speech attached, not to invite her in, not to impress her, but to prove to myself that I could hold a boundary without needing a barricade, and because the truth prefers endings that feel like breathing rather than verdicts, I let the thought drift away unsolved, turned the latch, and listened as the lock settled, a small, decisive sound that could have been a beginning if I were ready to call it that.